Hey y'all, what's up? Welcome back to ENL 3, Intro to Literature and Literary Studies, Being Human in a More Than Human World. Gonna talk, this is a midweek lecture, and I'm gonna talk about a specific poem in this lecture today and give kind of more examples of what kinds of questions to ask when analyzing poetry, what kinds of things to pay attention to, and how to think analytically and sustainedly about imagery, about lineation, the use of line breaks and stanzas and form on the page that we haven't talked about yet. And we're going to talk about ars poetica, a thing I've mentioned in some of the descriptions of weekly forum posts or assignments or whatever, poems about poetry. So I'm going to focus on Margaret Atwood's poem Psalm to Snake, which we're reading for this week. So I think I'll just read the poem and then get into it and kind of jump into giving some examples of analysis. This is Margaret Atwood. I assume this is a picture of her on the cover of her Selected Poems number 2 book. As I've said in other contexts, Margaret Atwood is primarily known as a fiction writer. She wrote The Handmaid's Tale, the book that the show is based on, and other stuff like that. But she's also a wonderful poet, and she has many books of poems. I could find out when this poem is from. This poem was published in a book in 1984. There's a whole bunch of snake poems in this book. The book is interlunar, for those of you who are into it. Margaret Atwood, Psalm to Snake. Psalm to Snake. O snake, you are an argument for poetry, a shift among dry leaves when there is no wind, a thin line moving through that which is not time, creating time, a voice from the dead, oblique and silent, a movement from left to right, a vanishing, prophet under a stone. I know you're there even when I can't see you. I see the trail you make in the blank sand. In the morning, I see the point of intersection, the whiplash across the eye. I see the kill. Oh, long word, cold-blooded and perfect. That's Psalm to Snake by Margaret Atwood. As I said, ars poetica is a tradition in poetry for hundreds of years. Poets have written poems, sometimes literally called. The title of the poem is ars poetica, sometimes not. But this long tradition where poets within their poems comment on the nature of poetry, what poetry is, what they think it should be, what they think it can do, how they think poetry works. Sometimes it's about more than just poetry, but about language or art more generally. But this is a great tradition. Poets love writing about poems and about the power of their artistic medium. Sometimes it's more explicit, and ars poetica can be like directly commenting on poetry. Sometimes it's implicit or even metaphorical. They might not say anything about poetry exactly in the poem, but you kind of get a sense that they're saying something about what they think, what poetry means to them. This one, Psalm to Snake, sets itself up as an ars poetica right away in the first 2 lines. O snake, you are an argument for poetry. And so what follows from those first 2 lines, that first stanza of the poem, you can't read it, I guess, but it's kind of the first stanza, the 2-line stanza, ends with a colon here, and then what follows is her, the speaker of the poem, talking to the snake and discussing the ways in which the snake's nature and behavior says something about or in favor of poetry. O snake, you are an argument for poetry. Now, that clearly tells us that this is a poem about poetry, that this puts it in the tradition of ars poetica, but I think about that line and just thinking kind of critically or analytically, trying to reflect and ask questions to get me deeper into the poem. What is an argument for poetry in the first place? Why does poetry need an argument in favor of it? And in what ways can this thing that's not poetry, a snake, be an argument for poetry? What does that say about the relationship between nature or animals or life and poetry or language or art? So that's one question that the poem raises for me immediately. In analyzing this poem, I think I would go through stanza by stanza, line by line, and think about how this is a very imagistic poem. So I'd think about how these different images say something about both snakeness and poetry, and what exactly it's saying about poetry and why. A shift among dry leaves when there is no wind. So the snake moving under leaves and giving evidence of itself, even if it can't be seen exactly. When there is no wind, the only movement that could be producing this is the movement of the snake, or the movement of poetry. Even when it can't be seen, it's producing an effect that might startle you, or might draw your attention. A thin line moving through that which is not time, creating time. That's pretty abstract when I think about how a snake moves. I would never think to say snakes move through not time, creating time. I have to think about that image a little bit more and sit with it and let it percolate in the back of my mind. But I can sort of see how that says something about poetry, that the movement of a poem through line by line, stanza by stanza as you read it, is creating an experience of time. I saw this Facebook post like a couple months ago or something, where somebody said, like, the post was like, my friend said, if art is how we decorate space, music is how we decorate time. And I was like, damn. And so this thing makes me think of that in a way. Poetry is about creating time, or about decorating time and how we move through it. A voice from the dead, oblique and silent. A silent voice, first of all, is a contradiction in terms. Voices can't be silent, and yet poetry produces this contradiction in itself. When you look at a poem on the page, there's no voice, it's silent, and yet as you read it, it creates a voice. It is a voice from the dead. Margaret Atwood, I think she's still alive technically, and yet she produces kind of a living voice of the dead here in how she calls forth meaning from the poem, from these lines on the page. And so I think I'd work my way through the poem like this, just kind of thinking about, what does this say about poetry? How does poetryness and snakeness relate in this line, in this image? And I wouldn't want to settle on just one answer. I want to sit with these images and let them, as I said, percolate a little bit and see what comes to me. That's how we produce non-obvious observations and insights in analytical thinking, is taking our time, sitting with the data and seeing what comes, not just settling for the first answer that comes to mind, but thinking more about it, trying to figure it out. So this poem is kind of, throughout the images, I find it's kind of repeating again and again a kind of movement, a movement of the unseen or the unheard, something that draws the eye or draws the attention from the periphery, in the way that it's kind of both seen and unseen at the same time. And so it's saying something about poetry's mysteriousness, poetry's kind of supernatural or magical ability to be both heard and not heard at the same time, to move from under a pile of dead leaves and produce something that draws the attention. And so I think about that kind of relationship between absence and presence as one of the themes of this poem. A quick tip for literary analysis: when you're trying to figure out what the themes of a work are, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, it might help to think of like a binary or a dichotomy, or a set of related but different terms that are working through the text. So presence and absence, movement and stillness, voice and silence, might be violence and peace, might be different kinds of of thematic terms to explore how they work in the poem or in the novel when we get to that and stuff like that. And then this poem ends with this violent, gruesome image that feels a lot different than what has come before. And obviously we can see how that relates to snakeness, but I wonder about what that's saying about poetry and about what Margaret Atwood thinks poetry is good for. Cool. So one other thing I wanted to talk about in this poem, and it would help if you have it in front of you or you can look back at it, after watching this video or whatever, is the question of lineation, line breaks and stanza breaks. So in general, the thing that sets poetry apart from other forms of writing is that it uses line breaks, that the lines don't always go to the end of the page. The poet gets to choose where the line ends. And poets have used this in a lot of different ways throughout the different traditions of poetry. Sometimes the line acts as a unit of sound. If you've heard of, you probably heard in high school, iambic pentameter is what Shakespeare wrote in a lot, right? That means a line for him was 5 sets of a specific alternation of accents, of syllables. And so for him, a line was a unit of sound. It was ba-bum, 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 ba-bum is the sound of a line of poetry. And so sometimes a line is a unit of sound. Sometimes a line is a unit of thought. A line might say an entire thought, and then the next line is a new thought. There are different ways of organizing lines or making it a unit of different things. But the thing that's weird, that's difficult sometimes about poetry is that the line is simultaneously like its own unit, and it fits into other kinds of ways of making meaning. So in this poem in particular, if I just read out the lines and really emphasize the line breaks, "Oh, snake, you are an argument for poetry, a shift among dry leaves when there is no wind, a thin line moving through that which is not time, creating time." And so the line breaks here, first of all, they utilize enjambment. They don't always end on punctuation or at the end of a syntactical clause. They force you forward by especially that a thin line moving through that which is not time. That's hard enjambment there. It's like forcing you forward in the syntax of the sentence. And so these units, whatever she's using these lines as units of, do not exactly match up with the sense and syntax of sentences. The lines interrupt sentences. And so, first of all, that's, might make it a kind of complicated poem to hear the rhythms of. But at the same time, I think that movement of interruption and enjambment that interrupts the meaning of the sentence and makes you focus on the words and creates these little hidden moments of double meaning. A thin line moving through that which is not time. You can read that 2 ways. A line of poetry moves through that which does not exist. It moves through non-being. I don't know what that means exactly, but I think it's pretty cool. Or it moves through that which is not time. I still don't know what that means and still think it's pretty cool. So anyway, lineation is a tool that Margaret Atwood uses in this poem. She uses enjambment and interruption through her unorthodox lineation and stanza breaks as well. And I might ask, how does that relate to the different themes that I was discussing previously in this video? How does it relate to what the poem is saying about poetry? How does it help her enact or create or represent her experience of poetry? What does that interruption and rhythm and movement have to do with what she's saying? And so that's kind of a question that'll often get you, I think, pretty far in analyzing poetry especially, but analyzing any kind of art or literature or film or whatever. It's by thinking about the connection between the form, between the stylistic strategy and the themes, the content, the ideas of what is being presented. I see a lot of connection here in Margaret Atwood's Psalm to Snake between the form of the poem on the page and what she's saying about poetry and the ideas she's presenting. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. That's Ars Poetica, lineation, enjambment, imagery, and looking at patterns of imagery. And, so what I just said here, I think, raises a lot of questions. If I were going to write an essay, my first essay, which I'm going to release the essay assignment to you next week, if I were writing my essay about this poem, I would seek to address some of those questions, and I would see where my attention kind of naturally is drawn and what seems the most important to me, and I would focus on a few key points. Maybe I'd write a paragraph or two about enjambment and what it's doing here, and maybe I'd focus in on one specific image in the poem and kind of think about what's going on in it and write a paragraph or two about that, and then see how it all adds up. And my goal would be to work my way into a deeper, more complex understanding of the poem, the poem's themes and ideas, and the poem's strategies, how it is accomplishing or creating those ideas. So yeah, that's all I've got for you today. I look forward to reading your discussion posts this week, whether it's about this poem or the other poems we're reading. And yeah, as always, feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. Thanks, y'all.